we have had a meeting with the Prime Cabinet Secretary and Cabinet Secretary for Foreign and Diaspora Affairs, my brother, Honorable Wycliffe Musalia Mudavadi, who led a team of government officials. This was in regard to my candidacy for the African Union Commission chairmanship. I wish to reiterate the obvious, that I am vying for a position in Africa, not in the government of the Republic of Kenya. But I need the endorsement of the government of Kenya for that African position. At this meeting, we exchanged notes on the state of the quest so far, the preparations from my side and the government side, and the next steps that require to be taken. I've been requested by many friends, because many people have been surprised and been wondering how I came to this. Many of my friends from outside Kenya approached me and told me that this position of AU chairmanship is becoming vacant next year. They have looked around the continent and feel that among the people who may offer themselves, you have the best credentials to take this organization forward. After lots of soul searching and consultations among my colleagues and friends, I made the decision to agree to accept the request. As you know that I had been the African Union High Representative on Infrastructure Development for 5 years. That position gave me an inside picture of what is happening in the AU, what the potentialities are in the AU, what are the challenges, and what are the weaknesses that they exist there. We agreed that coordination and synergy are going to be critical as we embark on the next critical steps that include the submission of my application. We therefore agreed on the need for efficiency, the need to cut bureaucracy, and unveil a well-oiled and flexible joint effort going forward. Like all campaigns, plans emerge and change suddenly. Demands arise and change suddenly, and we need to be able to respond to them as suddenly as they emerge. We also agreed on the need to understand the sensitivities in this quest that include national, regional, continental, and global dimensions to this quest, and therefore the need to always act responsibly, bearing all these sensitivities in mind. Once again, I thank Kenyans and the government for the support and the promise to keep updating the country on the status of the race. If we improve matters in Africa, Kenya becomes a beneficiary. One example I want to give is inter-African trade. Inter-African trade currently stands at only 15%. Africa trades very little with itself. Inter-European trade stands at 70%. Inter-Asian trade is now getting towards 60%. Even South America stands at about 30%. But Africa does not trade with itself for reasons, some of which are actually solvable, or problems solvable. You see, there are tariff barriers which have been introduced by some African countries, which makes it very difficult for goods to move from one African country to another African country. Secondly, there is infrastructure challenges that makes it very difficult for Africa to trade with itself. You know, Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is now 2 years old, but still very little progress has been made, mainly because of these two major barriers. As the High Representative on infrastructure, I realized the challenges. Like you've been talking about intra-African highways, the Cape to Cairo, the Dakar to Djibouti, Dakar, Lagos, Lagos, Mombasa, and so on and so forth. We've been talking about the continental high-speed railway network, one Beira to Walvis Bay, one the old Benguela line, Lobito to Lubumbashi. The other one is the high-speed railway along the coast from Lagos to Cairo. The other one is our LAPSET, the Lamu Port, South Sudan, Ethiopia Transport Corridor, which as a representative of the AU on infrastructure, we actually extended from Juba through Bangui in Central African Republic to the Port of Cameroon to create a land bridge that links the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean and opening up the interior of the continent, which are landlocked for trade. See, for example, Kenya grows tea. How does Kenya export his tea to Central African Republic? Between Kenya and Central African Republic, there's only South Sudan. South Sudan is the only country between Kenya and Central African Republic. But how do you take the tea there? There's no infrastructure. You have to find a ship that will go around the Cape, along the western coast, to the Cameroonian port of Douala, and then by road to Bangui. The French are there ahead of you. That's why they drink in Bangui Kenyan tea, christened as English breakfast tea. But with an upset, we can be able to take our goods there. But this infrastructure cannot be developed country by country. You need to have a mechanism at the center that is coordinating funding for the infrastructure. If you want to do the LAPSET, Kenya can only do its part up to the border with South Sudan. Then South Sudan needs to take it from there to the border with Central African Republic. Central African Republic takes it to Cameroon and to reach there. But you need a center to be able to coordinate funding, to mobilize funding for this infrastructure development, which are cutting across the continent. That is why those things have not been done. Afro-optimists are those who believe in the ability of the African people to develop Africa. That Africa, the richest continent on the planet Earth in terms of resources, is also the poorest in terms of development. This is a paradox that we want to solve. We want Africans to be able to take charge of Africa. We want to expand the communication and trade among the African people. I was telling my brother here that when I was a student in Europe in the 60s, it was a nightmare to travel across the continent of Africa, of Europe. In Europe, to move from one country to the other, you needed a visa. And if you do not have a visa to transit in one country, they arrested you at the border and returned you where you come from. Today you can travel across the whole of Europe, the Schengen visa. You want to enter somewhere and you can go to all parts of Europe. Yet in Africa you still have a problem. Aliko Dangote, one of the most prominent African businessmen, was saying just the other day that he needs 35 visas to travel across the continent of Africa. His French counterpart, who is his competitor, does not need, using a French passport. With a Nigerian passport, you need 35 visas to travel on the continent of Africa. You ask yourself, why? Why can you not have one African visa? It can be done.